is Lindsey Dunn talking to Tyler Smith. Tyler, thank you so much for agreeing to talk to me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Yeah. So I just watched your movie called Real Redemption, The Rise of Christian Cinema. It's a documentary, or some are calling it a video essay, the sometimes contentious relationship between the church and cinema, focusing on times and films that Christians heralded and sometimes rallied against since the miracle of movies started. So, how did your love of cinema start?
Oh my, I mean, I've always, when I was a kid, I always liked movies. It was like my favorite thing to go and do. It was my favorite, it was back in the days of video stores. So one of my favorite things to do would like go to a video store with my family. And thankfully I had parents that were very, what I call movie positive. In Christian circles, it's not a given that parents will be super into movies and into their kids seeing movies, but I was pretty fortunate in that regard because both my parents really adored movies. And then I also had an older brother, which came in handy for whenever there was a movie that my parents didn't want me to see. Thankfully, I had a rebellious older brother who would rent it, and then we'd watch it together. And so that's how I wound up seeing, some Tarantino movies when I was probably a little bit too young to watch them. Yeah, I think it was just, I don't know what it was. I think it was all of these things, and I certainly would not have been able to verbalize this at the time, but it's just all of these things coming together. The music, the sound design, the cinematography, the editing, all of that, and the story itself, like coming together to act on your instinct and your emotion. And I think when you're a kid, of course, everybody's intellectual to the degree that they are able to be, and so when you're a kid, your understanding of things is limited, but and you're still developing emotionally, but your emotions are there first and foremost. And I think that film is, I'd say, primarily an emotional or instinctive medium. Obviously, there's plenty of analysis that can go into it and plenty of intellectualization, but I think first and foremost, it is an emotional and instinctive art form. And so as a kid, I just responded to that. I was just totally, I would just get lost in these movies when I would watch them. And, in retrospect, when I go back, it's like some of these movies weren't that great. But as a kid, I was just so excited. I was just on board with pretty much anything a movie wanted to do. And so I grew up in a very, a movie positive household. And even outside of that, I myself just really responded to them.
What are some of the first movies that you remember really falling in love with?
Well, like so many other people my age, certainly boys, but it's kind of universal. I mean, Star Wars, like the original Star Wars trilogy, the last of those films, Return of the Jedi, came out in '83, which was a year after I was born. So by the time I was old enough to be watching stuff, like all of those movies were on video. I would watch them over and over again and really love them. I watched Raiders of the Lost Ark, more so than Temple of Doom. And then I guess, Last Crusade wouldn't come out until '89, but yeah, the Star Wars movies and then the 1984 Ghostbusters, like those really captured my imagination. But then the one that I would come back to over and over again, even though it scared me, was Jaws. I didn't mind being scared when I saw Jaws. I certainly, to this day, if I go into the ocean, it's like, well, obviously I'm going to die. There's no question about that. But I lived in the middle of a desert community, so I was mostly fine as a kid. And I do think that Steven Spielberg as a filmmaker, just his sensibilities. Now, obviously, he makes very adult films as well, like Saving Private Ryan and Munich and Schindler's List. But I think when he latches on to like a very mainstream action or adventure or horror film, he makes it in a way that is broad enough, and I don't say that in a negative way, it's broad enough to really capture the imagination of even the youngest viewer. You go and watch Jurassic Park or E.T. or, as I mentioned already, Jaws. And yes, there are moments that are extremely intense, but there's also these moments of awe. And there's a universality to the way he makes movies that I think really lends itself to audiences of all ages. And so a lot of the films that he had released at that time, like E.T. and Jaws and that sort of thing, really, really worked for me. And I'm trying to think, there are probably some Disney movies as well, like some animated films. I remember really liking Peter Pan and Alice in Wonderland, even though that one kind of freaked me out a little bit at times, and Winnie the Pooh. So the Cheshire Cat like really creeped me out. I love him now. I adore him. But the Cheshire Cat, and then you go back and watch, man, you watch Pinocchio, and it's a marvelous film. I adore it. But to this day, Lampwick turning into a donkey is extremely disturbing. And certainly as a kid, even though I watched Pinocchio over and over again, we got to that part, and I wouldn't like, and I would just watch in absolute horror, but I couldn't stop watching. And there's just something so perverse about that. It's like what they say, you know, when you drive by a car accident, you just can't help but look and see what it is. Even if you don't want to see something really horrible, you just can't help but be enamored of the things that are frightening to you. And that was definitely the case with me as a kid. And to a certain extent, me now, like I have a terrible fear of spiders. So if there's a spider-related horror movie, it seems like I wouldn't want to watch it, when in fact I'm the first in line. Like I can't wait to see it, even if it keeps me from sleeping later on that night.
You've talked a little bit about your love of movies growing up. How did you come to the decision to begin studying film as a career?
I think so. When I was a kid, I was creative, or at least creatively minded. I certainly had no patience for sports, watching them or playing them. Not to mention I wasn't particularly good at them. But I enjoyed drawing. I enjoyed writing stories. And I think there comes a moment where, probably in middle school, where the things that inspire you, they inspire you to do these other things. But then after a while, you're like, well, I like this stuff. I like movies. I like telling stories in a dramatic way. But I'm not doing that. So why don't I just do that? And so I started getting into acting in middle school and high school. And I acted on stage, and I really enjoyed it. And I was pretty good at it. And that was itself exciting, because there wasn't much else I was good at. And then comes that moment where you're just like, you know what? I would like to write something that I would then act in. And so then you start writing, and then you start making films with your friends, you know? And I think you can get really addicted to that idea of the contents of my head are now being seen on screen. And so I think I really got into that in high school, but I also didn't. I had no real so I acted a lot on stage, but I didn't really want to stay there, because I was also in high school part of like the TV video class, and I really enjoyed that. And I thought like, well, this is A, all I'm really good at, B, all I'm really interested in. So I guess I'll just pursue this. And I mean, it sounds weird. I don't think anybody ever described like pursuing film as a pragmatic decision, but for me, it very much was, because I wasn't passionate about anything else, and I wasn't really good at anything else. So I went to film school in Chicago and studied writing, directing, and critical studies. And I moved out and then my wife and I moved out to Los Angeles in 2007. And the goal was to pursue writing, but in the meantime, I co-founded a podcast called Battleship Pretension in 2007, and it was just a fun hobby, but I enjoyed it so much that I started to just lean in that direction, like lean in the direction of film criticism. And so, you know, I got into like writing reviews and doing interviews with people, and really loved it. And then that actually opened some doors to do some public speaking and talk at some colleges, which then made me want to pursue teaching. And so just like one thing led to another, and I keep discovering something as a function of something else. And so now I do the criticism thing, but I also went back to school and got my master's, and I teach at the college level now. But but one thing that I've always been interested in, being raised as a Christian and still being a practicing Christian, I've always been fascinated at like the intersection of art and faith, because those tend to be two communities that look at each other with suspicion. And so I've talked at various film festivals and ultimately wound up making this movie, which explores that intersection and is attempting to bridge that gap. I made it, I'd say, not primarily for a Christian audience, but that's sort of where I got the funding. So I kind of had that audience in mind, but hopefully it gets Christians who are not super into the idea of movies, certainly not Hollywood, gets them a little bit more open to the idea of the potential of film. And then also gets, non-Christian film critics to see the potential, I'd say largely unrealized, but the potential of like faith-based films. Most of them I think are pretty awful, but they don't have to be. And when I went back to school, I went to UCLA, and I remember so like I had been accepted, and so you go and you visit, and they essentially pitch the program to you. Well, it's the only school I applied to, so I was going to say yes no matter what. They said, does anybody here have any questions? And I asked, like, is there anything, like, because my thought was like, movies have been around for a while. Like, what mark could I possibly make in the world of film academia? And so I asked, is there anything that is not being talked about at this point? And at the time, the person that was asking for questions, she said that she couldn't think of anything. But then a teacher later told me, he said, nobody in the academic world is talking about faith-based film. And in the critic world, they're talking about it. If they're not dismissing it outright, they're talking about it derisively. Again, understandably so. Faith-based film is often unwatchable, but it's still people that are it's filmmakers that are looking to express themselves creatively, and that itself warrants another look, or at least trying to explore where it could go, And so the decision, and I wrote an essay in school about faith-based film as an emerging genre. And so I pitched this idea to Faith Life TV as like an opportunity, since there's so little like academic conversation being had about this. Like, well, I guess I'll start. I can contribute what little I can with this film, which again, hopefully will pique the curiosity of Christian viewers who maybe view film as a medium with suspicion, but then also suggest that, yes, Christian film is not very good for the most part, but that doesn't mean it can't be. So let's try to, rather than just dismiss it out of hand because it may not fit with what we believe, maybe let's try to explore what it could be and the effect that it's having on mainstream films as well. And so, yeah, I'm trying to kind of ride that line in between, and I'm not totally sure if one group is being affected more than the other, or either of them are being affected at all. But that was the goal anyway. I've talked with a lot of Christian filmmakers, albeit sort of independent Christian filmmakers, who've had varying levels of success within the industry. And so many of them have said, like, hey, the films that we want to make are ones that actively explore the difficulty with which somebody tries to live a faith-filled life, whether it be dealing with temptation, dealing with doubt, dealing with loss, and exploring the idea that we don't have all the answers, and then moving forward, not necessarily as though we had the answers, but as though there are answers out there, and we're going to have to sort of take a leap of faith to get there. So like the filmmakers, granted not all of them, but like a lot of the filmmakers are very interested in sincerely exploring their faith artistically. But then any number of them will say, well, the money people are not interested in that because the audience with exception, of course, but the audience is not interested in that. They want some. They certainly don't want anything that could offend their sensibilities as far as profanity or nudity or even violence. But also they want something that affirms. Like that's like literally there's a studio called Affirm Films, and it's not called Challenge Films. It's called Affirm. Like people like having their values, and I don't just mean Christians. I think people in general like having their values affirmed. And when you're a Christian and you feel like Hollywood has been against you for decades and decades, then the last thing you want is something that challenges you, because you might view that as, oh, this film is wanting me to reject. Well, it's like, no, it might actually just want to deepen your faith, but any kind of questioning is viewed as negative. And so that's from the perspective of the audience, which means the money people realizing like, well, people aren't going to see this, or the word of mouth is going to be very negative, and we're not going to get any return on our investment. So there's pressure on the money people from the audience, and then on the directors from the money people. And so you wind up with a product that is heavily compromised, and winds up just being, affirming is one way of looking at it. Pandering is another way of looking at it. And so I think that's the real problem with the industry as it is right now, is like you have and this is where I'm going to sound like a jerk, but you have an audience, an intended audience that frankly is not particularly sophisticated when it comes to what they want out of a movie, because they're still kind of new to watching movies. And my hope is that within the next 10, 15, 20 years, Christian audiences who right now are embracing God's not dead, in a few years, they'll start to demand more of themselves, or they'll so many people, they're like, I'm tired of being pandered to. I already know this stuff. I want something new. I want something challenging. And so as the audience starts to want more, then you'll have executives and filmmakers willing to take more risks. But that might just be me being optimistic. I don't know.
I wanted to touch on The Last Temptation of Christ specifically, because clearly, I notice things are probably more important the more time you spend on them. And, you spend a significant amount of time on that particular incident, whereas other things, you maybe discussed them, you showed a clip and then moved on. But that was like, you showed a clip, then you also showed scenes of people sitting outside the theater and capturing their thoughts. So what is it about that particular movie, or intersecting with that time, that you think, what is so significant about that movie?
I think for me, because it is the essence of, for a lot of Christians, I think that movie was like the essence of what Hollywood thinks about faith. Now, I'm a Christian and I adore Last Temptation of Christ. Like, I watched it, and not only do I think it's a marvelous film, but I myself felt edified a little bit by the movie after I watched it. But by the time I watched it, which I think I was probably like 19 when I first saw it, and I watched it I was very wary of it, because all I had heard going in from my community, because I wasn't like in college yet, so I wasn't surrounded by movie people, but I was surrounded by fellow Christians. And all I had heard was, this movie is sacrilegious. It's blasphemous. Watch it at your own peril. Not your soul's peril, but be careful when you watch it. And so I watched it and I was like, this is amazing. Like, this is an exploration of the humanity of Jesus. We certainly spend plenty of time both in this movie and in other movies with the deity of Jesus, but not the humanity, not the doubt, not the emotion, not, the stuff that everyday people can relate to. But none of the Christians that I knew were willing to include them, partially because they hadn't seen the film. Like, so many people were condemning the film having not seen it, just word of mouth, completely free of context. And it bothered me, once I saw it, it bothered me that there were so many fellow Christians who who were limiting themselves intellectually and, in my opinion, spiritually. Like, I think they could watch this movie and get and feel closer to God, to Jesus in their spirituality if they would just get out of their own way. And so you go back and you look at, like, this came at the end of the Reagan era, at the end of sort of a resurgence of, like, you know, the religious right and that sort of thing, the moral majority. And it just seemed like this film was like the official split. Like, this was the one where everything came to a head. Like, certainly there had been protests before, but like this, in recent memory, this was like the biggest one where, and probably critics and audience, Christian audiences saw it as like, the critics love it and it's getting nominated for awards and it's against us. So, you know what? So, like, I think they looked at the acclaim with which it was received by the non-Christian intelligentsia, and they said, this is proof. Like, if they're going to champion this movie, this is proof that they are not on our side. And so you had a whole group of people, and it's clear, like, I am frustrated. I'm more on the side of the critics in this case than fellow Christians. And so, so I feel like, and all of this with a lot of people having not seen the film. And so I wanted to spend time on that, partially because I also knew in retrospect that there would be another movie that would come out 16 years later that Christian audiences would flock to, but critics would have a problem with, which is The Passion of the Christ. And so I liked the idea of of juxtaposing these two films, both of which got a lot of attention, not because of the film itself, but people's reaction to it. And so I liked the idea of using these two movies and showing, like, the polar opposite reaction to them.